Good afternoon, Mecca Cheisa. It's so nice to have you here from Canterbury, England.
Thank you, Sigrid.
Got some questions I want to ask you about your history as a behavior analyst.
Mm-hmm.
We want to put this on our wiki, our history wiki.
Mm-hmm.
It's talking about all the behavior analysts that we can get to talk to us about their history.
Mm-hmm.
So my first question is, how did you become a behavior analyst?
It was a long time ago, so forgive me if my memory is a little bit cloudy. I was doing a degree in psychology at the University of Wales in Cardiff, and in my first year I studied some philosophy, which I found fascinating. I think part of me has always had this thing for conceptual analysis. And I got into my second year, and I was only allowed to study psychology in my second year, and I hope I'm not insulting anybody, but I have to say I was a little bit bored by it. And then somebody who, it turns out, was a very famous professor in behaviorism, as we used to call it in those days, Professor Derek Blackman, walked into the room and started talking about behaviorism. And this, I have to say, this made me sit up a little and think, oh, that's different from all that other stuff that they were teaching me. And in the first week he talked about rats pressing levers. And I have to say, in my, the naivety of youth and the ignorance of youth, I wasn't massively fascinated by the rats pressing levers part of that, but I was fascinated by the fact that the data this man was showing was somehow more scientifically satisfying than data that other lecturers and professors were showing me, and he wasn't talking about rats expecting things and rats choosing to do stuff. He was talking in observable terms. And the following week, the same professor came into the room and started talking about the shaping of human consciousness through verbal behavior learned in a community, and he was invoking some of the same principles that he had invoked the previous week when he talked about the shaping of behavior of rats pressing levers. And that, I have to say, made me, well, it just stopped me in my tracks. I could not believe this man had managed to do that, and to do it in a way that was somehow conceptually and scientifically satisfying. It seemed improbable that this could be the case, and yet he'd done it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know which questions you're going on to ask me, but it was essentially the conceptual challenge that made me sit up and take notice. Some people respond to conceptual challenges with fear reactions. They don't want to know. Oh, don't tell me there's no such thing as the mind. Don't tell me mind-body dualism isn't true. Oh, not having that. But other people, and I'm in this camp, respond by sitting up and going, oh, wait a minute. Oh, but that's a bit of a challenge. That's a bit exciting. So that was my early interest in what we used to call behaviorism.
It's very interesting to me because it was very similar to my own experience.
Uh-huh.
When I heard the philosophical part, and it just really woke me up.
Mm-hmm,
it was completely opposite of everything I ever knew. So it's interesting to meet other people that
yes,
have that kind of reaction. What was it like to be a behavior analyst in those at that period, at that time when Derek Blackman was wowing a few students in Wales?
Well, I would be understating the case if I said it was tricky. It wasn't popular. This was in Britain, remember, and it was in the 1980s. It was in the days when what they nowadays call the cognitive revolution was apparently taking off, even though we know there was no such thing. But everybody was getting very excited by what was allegedly going on inside people's heads. And they were in that phase of the history of psychology where they had decided that behaviorism was dead, even though I had only just discovered this thing called behaviorism. And I'd only just discovered Skinner, and I'd only just discovered animal experimentation that didn't invoke concepts like mental maps and rats' expectations. So for me, this was very new, but psychology as a discipline at the time had sort of just about decided that it was old and that nobody was doing it anymore. So my professor, Derek Blackman, himself was very isolated. And I have to say, as one of 15 PhD students, I went on to become a PhD student with Professor Blackman. And I was the only person interested in behaviorism of those 15 PhD students. And I took my fair share of torture and ridicule for being interested in behaviorism. But, you know, I think I talk to my students about the history of behaviour analysis, and one of the things I tell them is that when a science comes along and it explodes some of the ways in which people have typically thought, then you will get these reactions. You will get people, you know, people went to the stake, people were burned at the stake for claiming that the Earth went round the sun. Darwin didn't publish until after his death because he was already being ridiculed. People will react like that, and if science means anything to you, and if a kind of coherent conceptual scheme means anything to you, then you either choose to go away from it and not be involved, or you choose to just keep doing it. And I'm afraid I have a stubborn streak, which meant that I just kept doing it. I just kept wanted to keep doing it because it made sense to me. In itself, it's coherent, and I like that.
I understand. So it makes perfect sense to me. So much of your work, perhaps most of it, I think most of it from what I know of your work, has been in the conceptual area.
Mm-hmm.
What area of that work would you most like to be remembered for?
That's a tough question. I haven't thought about that one. I think it would have to be for the kinds of conceptual analysis that I can't claim were original, because of course I derived all of these kinds of ways of thinking from the people that I was reading, you know, the Murray Sidmans of this world and the B.F. Skinners of this world, and a woman called Vicky Lee, and you know, Phil Heinlein and Mark Branch, and all kinds of things that I was just lapping up as an undergraduate. And I felt, when I became a postgraduate, I felt that there wasn't a single place you could go to that would bring together the philosophy of science, because it's a philosophy of science that's distinct from psychology. It doesn't share anything with that discipline that's called psychology. It's a natural science, and yet it's about a subject matter that has not really been, until behaviour analysis, hasn't really been consistently subjected to a natural science perspective. So I think if there was one thing I would want my work to be remembered for, it would be the kind of bringing together of those issues. What is it that allows us to say these things about behaviour and not those other things? And why do we not go down that road when we're trying to be scientific about behaviour? Why do we go down this other road? Why do we use single case experimental designs, etc.?
And I think you have done a really nice job of encapsulating that in your book, Radical Behaviorism. I think that captured many of those characteristics of radical behaviorism.
Thank you.
Set it aside, set it apart.
Yeah. In the preface to that book, it says that I hope it will do for other students. I hope the reading of it will do for other students what the writing of it did for me. It was, in a sense, it was a personal journey, because I couldn't find a single place. And I should say I was studying philosophy of science in my final year of my undergraduate degree. So it was the bringing together of the behaviorism and the philosophy of science, and I kind of needed to explore that, and I needed to find out if I was satisfied with the science, and then I wanted to write it down to see if other people would be interested and satisfied. And I'm very gratified for that. It was a bit of a surprise, let me tell you.
How do you, okay, so that was, when did you get your PhD?
Good question, hold on, I'll remember. 1990, I think? 1990. Yes.
So that was approximately a little more than 20 years ago. And how do you think behavior analysis has changed during that 2 decades?
Well, there are many more of us, for one thing.
Even in England.
Even in Britain, yes. I think the applied side has, well, it's done what every natural science does. It's, you know, it's kind of mushroomed. We know so much more about behaviour and the contingencies, controlling variables, 20-some years later than we knew then. I mean, we have whole technologies now that we could only dream of. And that's the same as every science. You know, you're sitting there with an iPad, I noticed. We were just, I think icons had just become the new computing technology while I was doing my PhD, and we were all, oh look, an icon, you press on it and something opens up, how about that? And now here we are, you know, we have telephones that we just pick up and phone across the world with, and we've got computers that are essentially, we've got telephones that are actually computers with telephones in them, and we can do all sorts of things. And we have the iPad that you're using here, all of which was just science fiction 20-some years ago. So in the same way as other sciences have really mushroomed and given us what science gives us, behaviour analysis has done the same thing. I can now talk to my students about things we know now that didn't exist 20 years ago, if you like. Even though they existed, we didn't know they existed 20 years ago. So yes, it's been a lovely journey watching this happen, and now I actually have every year a cohort of between 10 and 20 students of behaviour analysis. Who knew?
Who would have suspected?
I know, extraordinary, yes.
So if you had to do your career over again, would there be anything you would do differently?
Sometimes I've thought in the earlier days that I really should have, for my own personal well-being, that in a sense I should have walked away from behaviourism because it was so vilified and reviled, and it was very hard to be a behaviourist in not just a department but in a whole country of people who weren't behaviourists. It was really difficult to be there. So I did sometimes wonder if maybe I should just walk away and do something else, because it's not my first career, I should say. I've had other careers before that. Actually, no, I don't think so, to be honest.
That's nice.
Because I have so loved the conceptual analysis, and stuff I've done subsequent to my book is still conceptual analysis, but it's things that I've developed into. For example, I did an article on determinism and human behaviour, and that was new for me, and it was quite challenging. You know, what do you do with that topic? Because for us, we're okay about it, but other people aren't. So you have to think about, why are they not okay about it? And that was really quite an interesting challenge to do that work. So yeah, I don't know if I would have changed anything really.
You already made your change before you became a behavior analyst. You were something else, and then you became a behavior analyst.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at your longer career, that was what you did differently.
That was what that's true, nicely put. Nicely put.
What areas of the field today would you like to see more work in?
I think I'd like to see more sustained experimental work in the area that we call precision teaching. You can call it precision teaching, you can call it fluency building. I find that area interesting, but when I go out there to look for the scientific articles I'm not really finding them. I'm finding lots of people promoting precision teaching, lots of people promoting fluency-based instruction, but I'm not finding the nice, the nicely designed experimental treatments that tells us that actually, yeah, you really do want to do it. But for all we know, because this work hasn't been done in the kind of sustained way I'd like to see it done, for all we know, doing fluency training this way is not as effective as doing fluency training that way. Doing it this way might actually be damaging in the long term. We don't know these things. So I'm uncomfortable with people promoting fluency building, rate building procedures without seeing those basic experimental designs that make us confident that actually we are doing the right thing here.
Do you, this is sort of a side question pertaining to two comments you've already made, and that is, have you seen an increase, a decrease, or no change in the number of behavior analysts worldwide, let's say, who are seriously interested in theoretical and philosophical issues and conceptual issues?
I would say, well, first of all, we've had a very impressive growth in people who are interested in behaviour analysis. My impression is that many of those people are coming from applied settings, people, the autism explosion, and people who have been working in autism services. I think it would be unjust and unfair to say that nobody's interested in conceptual issues. I have my own students are people who work in learning disability services and or autism services, and they, as behaviour analysis is becoming more and more kind of recognised, it's a little bit more on the radar, people are now beginning to think, oh, maybe we should go and get trained in that thing that will help us to do better with our clients, our service users. Even some of my students, some of whom, for some of whom the course is utilitarian, got to get this, got to learn how to do this. But for other students, I see them actually, and it's quite interesting, I do see them sit up and go, oh, that's a bit of a surprise. I have my students read an adaptation of the article that I wrote in Determinism, and some of them are not slow to say, and we need to know this why. But others will literally come to me and go, determinism, I didn't know such a thing existed. They do respond by going, this is really, I can see the same response they're having that I had.
It's interesting because I've seen the same thing with people who come into it strictly from the applied standpoint. There's some percentage of them, it's not real huge, but there's some percentage of them who really get turned on when they get to the other parts of the things. So it's interesting.
And I
think
think
all kinds. We need
sure,
all.
And I think partly it's a responsibility that we have as people who are training and educating people in behaviour analysis, is to not just teach them how to take baseline measures, how to do momentary time sampling, blah blah, but to bring them into that. To be a behaviourist is to think in a particular way, and as John Berger said, it's a way of seeing. And I think it's our responsibility to bring them into that way of seeing.
I do too. I think the future of the field sort of requires it, but that leads me to my next question, which is, what do you see the future of the field to be? How do you see it playing out over the next 50 years, let's say?
Well, over that length of time, 50 years, I do see it playing out very positively. In the immediate future, I think we're struggling enormously, actually. I know you're struggling in your country, as we say. You're having battles with the psychologists and all kinds of other people. In Europe, we're having our struggles because I notice it particularly between people trained in behaviour analysis and people who've got certificates in education. From them, not from us, but from them, there is very much a turf war. What do you think you're doing? Teaching him maths? That's not your job, that's my job. I've got the teaching certificate. I think our responsibility is to get across the fact that, well, what you call teaching is changing behaviour, and hey, that's what we're doing. Yeah. So in the immediate future, I think we're going to have the same kinds of struggles that the early evolutionary biologists had. But in the long term, and science has demonstrated this in every sphere, the science will out. So 50 years from now, I see a very positive future for the field. Because frankly, the culture can't do without us. In the way we can't do without physics and engineering and all of those things, biology. Yeah. So they can't do without us.
If you had a message, a word of advice, a word of wisdom to say to the students of the future who may come and see your tape here and learn something about your history and listen to your words of advice, what would you say to the students of the future? What do you want to tell them? I think fundamentally it goes back to the conversation that we've just been having before that last point. I think fundamentally you have to learn to think and to see the world in that way, but also you have to learn that not everybody does see the world that way. Just because you're comfortable with determinism doesn't mean the person you're sitting next to is comfortable. And whilst we all, I do it, my students do it, my colleagues do it, we all have our little vents about other people's repertoires, and that's okay. But we do have to come back and remember that those other people who are giving us grief very often are coming from a very different place. They have a different learning history. So it's partly to get into that way of seeing, because it's a way of seeing that will ultimately play the science out, but also to remember that not everybody has that way of seeing, so we have to tap into their way of seeing. I like that very much. Thank you very much. Dr. Mecca Cheisa, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted, Sigrid. Thank you.